Hi, I'm Alison Avalos.
And I'm Kerry Chou.
Kerry, you recently undertook a pretty interesting analysis that I know you've already blogged about a couple of times, where you took a look at some historical trend lines with consumer price index and compared those to salary budget figures that we've reported in our WorldatWork salary budget survey. And I think it kind of sheds some light on why we are where we are and where we might be headed in the future. You know, wages have been somewhat stagnant, or at least the growth in wages rather. We haven't seen a large uptick in the size of increases that organizations are giving to employees. There's a lot of movement in a variety of economic indicators out there, and I think it leaves those of us who are in a position to try to figure out where the economy is heading and what an organization needs to do to stay competitive, what to pay attention to. And so, like I said, I think it's really fascinating what you've taken a look at. You started with the Consumer Price Index in the U.S. Talk about why you started there. I know there's a variety of factors to look at when you're thinking about or trying to predict or anticipate what's coming next.
Interestingly, one of the statistics that we report in the salary budget survey is the Consumer Price Index. And I've been seeing a lot of stories in the newspapers and on TV about, we have signs of positive movement in the economy, and this question just keeps arising. Well, when are wages going to start rising faster than they are? Now, one of the other things that has been particularly an upcoming, up and coming topic in human resources is this whole notion of analytics and metrics, and can we use data to predict? And so, I just kind of had the thought, hey, I've got these two statistics, and because the salary budget survey we've been conducting for 41 years now, we have a valid and long list of data points which we compare. And so the simple fact of the matter is I had the CPI data and I had the salary budget survey data, and I thought, well, let's just take a look for fun, and see what the correlation is, and from that perhaps we could sort of get an indicator of what happens to salary budgets up or down as the CPI moves up or down. So we ran a simple regression analysis, and lo and behold, we found actually a quite strong correlation on R squared, for those that care, of a 0.76, which is a very good correlation. And it's in a positive direction, meaning that as the CPI, Consumer Price Index, increases, salary budgets tend to increase quite consistently with the CPI. And hopefully what we can do is simply to say, to have another data point in our pocket to say, when are salary increases going to go up? Well, based on this fairly rudimentary analysis that we did, we probably aren't going to see significantly higher salary budgets until the figure, the Consumer Price Index, starts to go up. And where is it right now? Well, from a salary budget standpoint, it's about as bad as it could be. It's at 0.8% for 2014, which has only been eclipsed on the low side one other time in the last 50 years. So historically, the CPI is right now almost as low as it's been in my lifetime. So from a salary budget standpoint, if we look at that correlation, we probably have to think we may have to wait some period of time until the CPI gains momentum, and hopefully with that correlation we'll see salary budgets go up as well.
One of the things, Kerry, I wanted to point out about the analysis that you did was the perspective in terms of timing with Consumer Price Index and that viewpoint, because I do think that those who are trying to figure out what indexes they should pay attention to, this is an important piece. As you would expect, budgets tend to set your pay levels for the coming year or your planned pay increases. So the CPI period that was most highly coordinated to salary budget increases for actual 2014 budgets was actually over the calendar year for 2013. Not surprising, but it is important to note, because if you're thinking that maybe you can look back to the prior year, because budgets do tend to lag a little bit, when you're thinking about the relationships of these indexes, you actually find the most immediate prior year having the strongest correlation.
Yeah, that's correct. Of course, when I did my analysis initially, I just took 2013, for example, against 2013 CPI versus 2013 salary budgets, and so forth back through the years. And I did find a good correlation. But from experience, we know that many of our organizations and members, they're doing their budget setting probably towards the end of the previous year. So to the extent that you're not going to have next year's CPI data when you are in fact setting your budgets, it makes sense that we would look at, if we move the CPI data back 1 year from the budget data, would that improve the correlation as we suspect? And yes, it does significantly improve the correlation when you're looking at last year's CPI data versus this year's budget data.
And we're, of course, not trying to predict what's going to happen with salary budget increases based on one economic factor or even a specific handful. But there are other indicators that practitioners tend to think about, that your CEO may be hearing on the radio in the morning and coming to you wondering, hey, does this have an impact on us? Do we need to do something different with our plan? So when we think about kind of that myriad of opportunity to learn, understand, and try to best position your organization going forward, we think about things like the employment cost index, unemployment. That's certainly been in the news a lot lately. What did you learn about the relationship of some of these other indexes to salary budget increases?
Well, once we ran this with the CPI, just for curiosity's sake, I started pulling just a few other figures and just doing the correlations like we'd done before to see, just do a little investigation, see if anything pops up. So I picked some random, a couple of other random statistics. I looked at gross domestic product, GDP, which is a measure basically of economic output for the country. We looked at, of course, the employment cost index, which is about 70% tied to salary and wages and about 30% tied to budgets. So these are the costs that organizations show. I also picked another one at random, the federal funds rate. The federal funds rate is the rate at which banks loan money to each other, and one of the primary indices that is used to determine mortgage interest rates, for example. I ran those correlations, and interestingly, the employment cost index, well, probably not so interestingly, we would expect those two to be correlated, and they were. The federal funds rate and salary budgets, very, very highly correlated, as highly correlated as the CPI index. A couple of interesting statistics we ran that didn't really pan out were GDP. Now, we would expect, as economic output is increasing in the country or decreasing, we would see a corresponding increase or decrease in salary budgets. Actually didn't find much of a correlation between those two variables. Probably most surprising, I ran one against the unemployment rate historically versus the salary budget. You would think there would be a fairly good inverse relationship, right? As unemployment goes up, salary budgets would go down. In fact, the data shows there's not much of a relationship. What we don't want to do is say, oh, there's no relationship between unemployment and salary budgets. I'm looking at just two very basic statistics, and I'm not an economist, so there might be a very plausible explanation with that. I was just expecting to see a little bit stronger, probably an inverse relationship, as I mentioned. And the data shows there's not much of a relationship at all between those two.
I feel like that's as important to understand as the economic indicators that have perhaps a stronger relationship to pay planning, because I do I think we've all been in the position where somebody comes into our office and said, hey, I heard this, I read this, I've heard if unemployment gets below 6, down into the 5, suddenly we will have a change in most organizations' ability to attract and retain talent, or the talent pool is going to change significantly, or we're going to have a shortage of certain skills, or we're going to have a surplus of certain skills. And so what I really like about what you've done here is to kind of take a look across the board at a variety of things that may be playing a factor on an economic level, and in terms of the marketplace. Doesn't yet factor in what's happening within individual organizations, so of course you'll see a huge variety there. But it does provide a little bit better understanding of where there may be connections, where things may not be as closely tied, to hopefully prevent some of those knee-jerk reactions that may happen at an organization level, and so that everybody is just more informed and in their own organization can take all of this information and think about it in context of what they're trying to achieve and figure out their best plan going forward.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think it's important to note, we got a couple of comments on the blogs. One question was, oh, well, so should we now use the CPI to plan our salary budgets? And really the answer to that is, generally I wouldn't do that. I would continue to do what's worked for many years, which is you're collecting your salary data, you're doing your analysis, you're looking at reports like the Salary Budget Survey and other surveys that are out there in the marketplace. You're looking at how your own internal rates of pay are comparing to the market, and you're making your best judgments. We're looking at 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 larger, mid to large size companies that are supplying us data on an annual basis. And that really allows us to just sort of look at it from a macro level. So I really encourage people to keep doing what they're doing and not just throw that away and say, oh, we're just going to look at the CPI or the Employment Cost Index and make our adjustments based on that. But I would say the value is when we're looking at things from a macro level, trying to figure out, well, when are things going to turn around? In some of these statistics that we looked at, the Consumer Price Index, the Federal Funds Rate, the Employment Cost Index, we all see very strong positive correlations between all three of those statistics and salary budgets. So to the extent that any one of those indices is low, and we've already talked about budgets being low. The federal funds rate's about as low as it's ever been. It's been almost zero for the past several years. Employment Cost Index is about 2.2%, so not the lowest it's been, but probably a little lower than usual. And as we already mentioned, the CPI is sort of at a historic low right now. So all of those indicators, and based on the fact that we have found a good correlation between those and the budgets, again, to the extent that those are very low, it's probably not going to bode well for us in the immediate future in terms of we're going back to 3.5%, 4.5%, 5% merit budgets and salary increase budgets. It's probably not going to happen in the next 24 months.
Yeah, the research, Kerry, wants me to clarify the difference between a correlation and a causal relationship between things. And I think you hit the nail on the head, that just because any one of these or collectively all of these are moving in one direction or another doesn't necessarily mean we're going to see a certain trend or a shift in a trend happen with wage growth. And I also think it's important to remember, kind of at the crux of this and the purpose for this kind of analysis is not to come up with something else that you can rely on. The goal for most organizations when they're doing market pricing and salary planning is to make sure that they're competitively positioned in the way that they deem is appropriate for their organization. So as much as these indicators might help us give a sense of where things are headed next, it's still really important and part of the art as well as the science of the compensation profession to look at the actual survey data that you get from your competitors, your marketplace, to understand specifically what they're doing. Because as you've mentioned, there are many cases where these indexes are not correlated to those numbers.
Yeah, that's right. If you have the historical data that you've collected and the historical processes that you use to do your salary planning, what does it hurt to collect some additional data, to just do some poking around? I mean, that's essentially what I was doing with the SBS data and the CPI. It was just, I wonder if there's a correlation, and could that help us, again, from my blog title, Tea Leaves, which is really what it is. You're just sort of, you're not saying this is what's going to happen, but based on what's happened historically, there seems to be a relationship, and we can use that information to make better decisions.
Thanks, Kerry. It's been a pleasure chatting.
Thank you.